Author of life, we thank you for your word, and we ask that your Spirit would be with us this morning to transform us in heart and mind and soul. Amen. Now, as you may have noticed in your bulletin, I don't have a sermon for us this morning. We're going to be doing things a little different. First, I'm going to give us a little presentation on the history of Methodist-Indigenous relationships to help frame our conversation, and then after that, our guest today, Rob Larson, is going to sit down and have a conversation with me for a little bit after that. So, let's give some frame to that conversation. We're going to start at the beginning of the story, at least in the Methodist movement, with none other than John Wesley himself. Some of you may know that John Wesley came to Georgia early on in his life, before he had his Aldersgate moment or any of that. He came to Georgia in the hopes of coming and evangelizing to the native peoples. He ended up serving the church in Savannah, which was not good for him or the people of Savannah. But his hope the whole time was that he was going to get a chance to meet the natives and bring the gospel to them. So we're going to read a few selections from his journals, because John Wesley loved to write everything down, which is such a blessing for us historians. But what he records here is something that was said to him by a man named Tomochichi, who was a chief of the Yamacraw. If I remember correctly, Tomochichi was around 90 when he said this. He had visited England earlier in his life and was now back in the Americas. And Tomochichi said to John Wesley when he met him, "I am glad you are come. When I was in England, I desired that some would speak the great word to me, and my nation then desired to hear it. But now we are all in confusion. Yet I am glad you are come. I will go up and speak to the wise men of our nation, and I hope they will hear. But we would not be made Christians as the Spaniards make Christians. We would be taught before we are baptized." So right away, we see a reference to the history of Spanish evangelism in Latin America and North America, which was violent and bloody. And Tomochichi is saying, that's not the kind of Christianity we're looking to sign up for, so we would really like you to teach us about this thing before you bring us into it. Trying to start out on a open and inviting foot. A couple days later, John has this to say in his journal. If the slide will go. There we go. "My brother and I took boat, and passing by Savannah, went to pay our first visit in America to the poor heathens." So we can see right away this is not going to be a relationship that is built on mutual respect here. And yeah, this is going to give us a clue as to what the rest of the presentation is going to be like. Doug, could you go to the next slide for me? So then a couple months later, this is about 4 months later, John has been in Savannah, and he's been wanting to get out and preach to the natives, and he hasn't had a chance to do so. And so he says, "I hope the door was open for going up immediately to the Choctaws, the least polished, that is, the least corrupted of all the Indian nations." Now, I'm not sure exactly what John has in mind by the phrase "the least polished." I would guess that probably what he means is the least civilized, therefore the most innocent, the least corrupted. And so we have not just this idea that these are poor heathens in need of John's help, but that these are childlike people that are in need of his help as a developed white man. So here we have another exchange between Wesley and one of the leaders of the native peoples. This was a Choctaw elder named Chicali or Chigali. There are a lot of different spellings on his name. And we start with the words from we start with the words from John Wesley here. "If red men will learn the good book, they may know as much as white men, but neither we nor you can understand that book unless we are taught by him that is above. And he will not teach you unless you avoid what you already know is not good." And here is the response that John records from Chicali. It's hard for me to know how reliable this response is, given that John is the one writing these words down. It's also hard for me to know whether or not Chicali knows that this is what John Wesley wants to hear, and so that's what's said here. But Chicali's response is, I believe that. He will not teach us while our hearts are not white. And this idea of whiteness being the trait of a good Christian person is something that we are going to see come up later in our presentation as well. So, we are moving ahead a bit. John Wesley, as you may know, his time in Georgia was short. He had some disastrous personal relationships that caused him to flee back to America. That kind of closes that door on Methodist history until after the Revolutionary War. The Methodist Episcopal Church gets formed, starts spreading west with the rest of this new nation. And we're going to start with a little bit of good news here. So we're going to talk about the Wyandotte Mission. This was in Upper Sandusky, Ohio, and it was established in 1816 by a man named John Stewart. John Stewart was a black man who received a call to travel to the northwest to preach the word, and where that led him was to Upper Sandusky, where he met the Wyandotte. He lived and taught among them for 3 years until 1819, at which point the Methodist Episcopal Church formally recognized him as a preacher within the Methodist Church and recognized his work in Wyandotte as a Methodist mission. So that Wyandotte mission in Upper Sandusky was actually the very first domestic mission of the Methodist Episcopal Church and led to the creation of the Methodist Missionary Society, which is the predecessor to today's General Board of Global Ministries, which coordinates our missions all around the world. Now, during John Stewart's early contacts with the Wyandotte, there were some divisions among the Wyandotte as to whether or not they wanted to convert to Christianity. And physical altercations, there are stories I've read where people would get into a brawl in the church building that they were using and be thrown out. So again, not the smoothest first introduction, but by and large, this is going to be a much less violent kind of interaction than would be typical. A faction led by Between the Logs, who was a chief speaker for the Wyandotte, ultimately prevailed, and the Christian missionaries, including John Stewart, were allowed to stay among the Wyandotte. Like I said, the hostility of this mission is much less than what we're going to hear about in a little bit. The missionaries who lived with the Wyandotte lived and worked with them, adopted their traditional forms of dress, participated in the traditional labor alongside of them, and so it was sort of there was more mutuality here than we see in other places. And but just to continue on with the history here, John Stewart died in 1823 at the age of 37. So already, though, there had been other people who had joined him in that work in 1819 and were able to pick up where he left off. And so a year after John Stewart passed in 1824, a stone church building was built on that site under the leadership of the Reverend J.B. Finley. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act dictated the removal of all native peoples to areas beyond the Mississippi. So any native tribes that were living east of the Mississippi were to be forcibly removed if they had to be. United Methodists advocated on behalf of the Wyandotte, who they had been living and working alongside for almost 30 years at this point. But by 1843, their efforts to preserve the Wyandotte on their own land had failed, and the Wyandotte were the final native people group to be exiled from Ohio. And so upon that removal, the Wyandotte deeded the land that was held, that held their church and their graveyard into the trust of the Methodist Episcopal Church as a sign of the trust that had been built through their relationship. So here I've just got a couple pictures for you. That's the stone church that was built in 1824. You can see on the roof, rebuilt in 1889. The pictures beneath it are lists of some of the prominent converts alongside the missionaries and the bishops that presided over the mission. And then there's a picture of the graveyard with Between the Logs grave in the front there, some of the other prominent converts are buried behind him, and a monument to John Stewart. So now is where we're going to get into the kind of story that is more typical of interactions between white settlers and the native peoples. I'll warn you right now that this story is going to get a little bit graphic, so I apologize for that, but the history is what the history is. So in 1864, John Evans, this man on the left here, was the governor of Colorado. Now, if you don't know John Evans was a founding member and the first president of Northwestern University. He was also a founding member of Garrett Biblical Institute, which today is Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, one of the Methodist seminaries in the country. And John Evans is actually who the city of Evanston, Illinois is named after, because he gave the land for those schools to be built and was such a prominent member of those communities. So John Evans, in the world of Methodists at the time, was about as important of a figure as you could find in American Methodism. And like I said, at this point in time, he's the governor of Colorado, and he, in 1864, had called on white Coloradans to kill and destroy hostile natives in retribution for the killing of a white family just outside of Denver. He also formed a regiment, the Colorado Volunteers, under Colonel John Chivington, who is on the right side of the screen there. Chivington was a Methodist preacher until the Civil War broke out, at which point he enlisted in the Army and gained some prominence before ending up in Colorado. And so John Evans forms this regiment under Colonel John Chivington in order to carry out the kinds of attacks on native peoples that he had called for. So at the same time that John Evans is doing that and is clearly preparing for hostilities, he is also instructing friendly Indians to seek out places of safety, such as U.S. military forts. So he's preparing soldiers to do battle with the native peoples, and then at the same time he's telling the native peoples, hey, go hang out near our forts. A group of Cheyenne and Arapaho who were trusting in the promises that John Evans had made to them, made camp along Sand Creek near Fort Lyons, while Chief Blackkettle was negotiating for the aid that had been promised to them. And that's Chief Blackkettle there. He was a known peacemaker who at one point had met with President Lincoln and been gifted an American flag by Lincoln. Now, he is going to survive the events here at Sand Creek, but just 4 short years later, he's going to be killed during a massacre at the Washita River led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. So in addition to our Methodist connections here, we get a Michigan connection as well. So they are camped out while Chief Blackkettle is trying to negotiate for the food and blankets and other supplies that had been promised to them. It's mostly women and children and elderly folks. And on the morning of November 29th, 1864, Colonel Chivington, our good Methodist preacher, orders his men to attack the encampment without any discussion or warning. And so his soldiers descend on the camp, killing almost 200 people. They, not content to go in and murder people in the morning, go back in the afternoon to commit further atrocities. So they mutilated bodies, claiming scalps, limbs, ears, noses, and even cutting off people's genitals and cutting fetuses out of people to claim as trophies. I told you it was going to get a little bit graphic, but I don't think that's the kind of thing that we can turn an eye away from and really understand what happened here. So for those actions, Governor Evans decorated Chivington and his troops for their, quote, valor in subduing the savages. In case you're thinking, well, this was just how things were at the time, this is, you know, it's horrible, but that was the way people thought then. No, not so much. By 1865, so keep in mind Congress is still overseeing the Civil War, this happens and they take time to conduct multiple hearings on what has happened here because 2 of the officers at this battle refused to send their company in with Chivington. and wrote to Congress saying, you need to investigate this because what happened here was criminal. And so by 1865, Congress has done an investigation of the massacre. They have decried the actions taken by Chivington and his soldiers, and they promised reparations for the gross and wanton outrages inflicted. So certainly people had terrible opinions and did terrible things, and this is like above and beyond what people thought was acceptable. And the officer, by the way, who wrote the letter that got these investigations launched was gunned down in the street a couple months later by one of Chivington's associates. So that brings us a little bit further ahead in history to Indian boarding schools. You might have heard of these, especially in the last couple of years. They've been in the news. The first of these schools was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was established in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879. If you remember the quote from just a little bit ago about how the Indians needed to be white for God to teach them, that's the premise of these schools. Their guiding principle was to kill the Indian and save the man. So kill anything about a person that might connect them to their culture and their people in order to make them white and save them. Students at these institutions would be subject to corporal punishment for speaking native languages. They were forced to cut their hair to match Western styles, and they were forced to wear Western clothing. And of course, any of those just invited further corporal punishment if you tried to resist. We also now know that sexual abuse, malnutrition, and other abuses were common in these schools, and I'm certain you've heard some of the stories about mass graves that have been discovered at some of these sites. So these schools ran until the 1960s, and during that time period, thousands of Native children were abducted from their homes and subjected to this form of cultural genocide. And again, we have Methodist connections to this activity. Schools including the Shawnee Methodist Indian Manual Labor School, which was in Fairway, Kansas, and the Asbury Manual Labor School in Fort Mitchell, Alabama, were run by Methodists. And in 2021, when all of the news was happening about Indian boarding schools, the General Board of Global Ministries promised to investigate the names and locations of any Methodist-related Indian boarding schools in order to, quote, better understand our complicity in this form of cultural genocide and to bring the boarding schools more clearly into focus in our expression of repentance. So in case it's not clear for us that these schools were hardly schools, George Tinker, who is a member of the Osage Nation and a professor emeritus at Iliff School of Theology, which is another one of our Methodist seminaries, describes the reality of these schools by saying, pure and simple, these were not educational facilities. They were training Indian children for manual labor just to serve their white superiors. And again, this was well into the 20th century that these schools existed. So we are going to jump ahead quite a bit from the middle of the 20th century to near the end of the 20th century. If you remember, our story started in 1736, and we are now moving to 1988. So 250 plus years of terrible history. So in 1988, the United Methodist Church launched the Native American Comprehensive Plan. And the idea of this plan was to enrich United Methodist Native American ministries by the 4 points that are up here, which essentially are to develop and support new United Methodist ministries with Native Americans, to support those ministries which were already occurring, and to develop and support Native American leadership within the church. And then also to affirm the value and strength of the role of traditional, cultural, and spiritual contributions of Native American people. So in 1988, we finally start to recognize that, hey, we need to be intentional about this work, and this is when this plan is launched. The Native American Comprehensive Plan still exists today, and their current focus for the quadrennium of 2021 to 2024 are preserving Indigenous language, understanding Indigenous spirituality, addressing the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women and children, and seeking climate justice globally. So, 1988 is when we start that work. 2012, we start to take another step in our journey. the General Conference of the United Methodist Church embarked on a truth-telling journey discussing some of what we've heard today, especially the events at Sand Creek and others in which the Methodist Church has been complicit. And as a denomination, we were exhorted that this wasn't meant to be a one-time act of repentance. This wasn't to be like, okay, we've done our worship service, we've said we're sorry, it's time to move on. Every annual conference and every congregation was called upon to start undertaking the hard work of ongoing repentance. And we can see in the closing litany of the service from General Conference that we acknowledge, while some in the church protested its transgressions against indigenous people, the dominant pattern has been one whereby both its silence and its active support, the church has participated in the violation, the exploitation, and even the killing of indigenous people. Our congregations and ministries benefited from native lands acquired unjustly when it was not a result of outright confiscation. So jump ahead 4 more years, and we see some work being done to carry out the call that had been issued to us in 2012. By 2016, we passed a resolution on our social principles, paragraph 162A. This is a very long document. I encourage you to go look at it for yourself if you're interested in what it has to say, but I've tried to distill down sort of the major highlights for us. So this affirms native languages and affirms that many native traditions and rituals are contextual incarnational testimony that are vital to the work of the church and consistent with the gospel. It has rejected the doctrine of discovery, which was the idea that Europeans could just go and claim whatever land they wanted because they were doing so in the name of God. It affirms tribal sovereignty as an inherent international right of native nations. It recognizes that a knowledge gap exists in the UMC regarding native peoples and cultures, which results in racism and prejudice. It makes a confession of sin, both past sins and ongoing sins by the United Methodist Church against our American Indian siblings. And it calls on United Methodists to become more knowledgeable and to act on a number of contemporary issues that are affecting native peoples. Here in Michigan, that same year, we started doing our work. We held our own act of repentance and reconciliation. So this was back before we were the Michigan Conference. We were still Detroit and West Michigan, but we met together in Lansing, and we had the Reverend Glenn Chabon Kernell, who is a member of the Seminole Nation and Executive Secretary of Native American and Indigenous Ministries for the General Board of Global Ministries. His whole speech is up on the conference's Vimeo page if you want to go watch it. But one of the things he said during his speech was that we have to begin to acknowledge the history that exists, even if it is painful. To acknowledge the truth is the only thing that is going to allow us to truly heal, to truly see a tomorrow, a better world, a better church, a better place for all our children. And if I am not mistaken, is that not why we are here today? In hopes that suffering will end, in hopes that pain will end, in hopes that we as the church will not hurt anybody anymore. So, in 2019, something historic happened, something rare happened. That land that I mentioned that the Wyandotte people entrusted to the United Methodist Church was returned to the Wyandotte people. It was part of the bicentennial celebration of Methodist missions. So if you'll remember, that mission in Upper Sandusky was officially recognized in 1819, 200 years later. In 2019, representatives from the Wyandotte Nation of Oklahoma, the Wyandotte Nation of Kansas, and the Wyandotte of Androdon Nation, Michigan, were represented. And of that day, Chief Billy Friend, who is from the Wyandotte Nation of Oklahoma, said, "It will be a historic day for the Wyandotte Nation. 176 years ago, we left the mission church in the Methodist hands to take care of it for us until we came back. That time has come. We have a deep appreciation for the local community and the records and history community of the John Stewart United Methodist Church that have taken care of this church for so long. Now we look forward to working together with these people and preserving and maintaining this historic landmark." Oh, So again, some pictures for you. I went down there with my mom. You can see me on the left here with one of my classmates from seminary. The picture in the top middle, that is Chief Billy Friend receiving the paperwork for the land from Thomas Kemper, who was the General Secretary for the General Board of Global Ministries. And then in the bottom right there, you can see some of the Native leaders along with the bishops of our church preparing to lead us in a procession from the church to the mission site. So that brings us almost up to the present in 2021. As I mentioned, a lot of news came to light about the atrocities that happened in these Indian boarding schools. And so denominational leaders issued a statement condemning those schools, announcing an internal investigation by the UMC of our involvement in those schools, which I mentioned earlier, and also declaring our support for an investigation that was being launched by the U.S. Department of the Interior. And the general secretaries of all of these boards and agencies signed on to this statement, which I believe is every general board and general agency of the church was in support of this. And then that should bring us to the present, today, where the work goes on, and it's time for us to start thinking about what do we do as part of this work. So I'm going to invite our guest, who we are honored to have with us today, Rob Larson, to come up and introduce himself.
How would you in any way am I going to help? I'm Nish McCoy, Indishnakas, Bodway Wadami, Odawa and Dow, DB, Niak, and Debendagwis, Muskegon and Dochbia, Mko O and Dodum, Ahau Ew Migwich. So, Manowabin, or good morning, greetings, my name's Rob Larson. Given the gravity of this day, I felt like it was proper to begin with a traditional protocol greeting, which is a respectful thing that two Native citizens or two Indigenous people would give to one another as a show of respect. And so I felt like that was fitting. So translation of that is, my name's Rob Larson, my spirit name in Bodway Wadami or Potawatomi language is Nish McCoy. I'm also a resident here in the city of North Muskegon. I'm an affiliate professor at Grand Valley State University, where I teach natural resource management. And so I'm kind of embedded in this community. I'm also an enrolled tribal citizen with the Nottawassippi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. And the good thing about living in Michigan is we can pull out our Michigan map. If you want to know where my reservation, tribe's reservation is, it's about 20 miles south of Battle Creek. If you're a casino person, my tribe owns Firekeepers Casino in Battle Creek. And it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Miigwech, sure, thank you.
Rob, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your time and yourself with us. Obviously, your Native identity is important to you at this point in your life, but would you mind sharing a little bit with us about how you got to this point? Because I think most people walking down the street looking at you wouldn't right away assume, Potawatomi.
Right. So my journey has been an interesting one. You know, we grew up in Muskegon, West Michigan. We knew we were Native growing up. We were taught that, but we were disconnected from the culture. One of the things that happened in the late 70s and 80s is the tribal or the federal government started issuing land settlements to people with indigenous backgrounds as kind of trying to make restitution for the land that was lost, that our people's land that was lost. So we knew growing up we were Native. We just didn't know anything else. You know, you had mentioned the boarding schools and stuff, which we hopefully will get into a little bit further down the road. But there was just really this huge disconnection. And actually, I grew up in the church, was in the church till about 8 years ago, so 40 years. Part of that journey is I had begun the process of ordination in the Free Methodist Church. I was a worship leader just before I left. church at the Journey Church, but there was still something deep inside that was longing, that was missing from my life. And I told you my background's natural resource management. And so I have this deep connection with nature. I'm always out backpacking, hunting, fishing. We do maple syrup and the whole thing. And so as I started learning about the plants and getting connected to the world around me, I was like, man, something is missing. And so we got citizenship with our tribe in 2003, but even then at that point, it really didn't connect with me. It's only been in the last 7-8 years, so I'll be 48 this year. So so about 7 years ago. And I started just searching and digging and looking at the past, because you can't understand where you're going forward unless you look back at the past. And so since then, I've started taking language classes and learning like our beliefs and stuff, because growing up, we're taught the story of the Pilgrims and Indians, that Pilgrims came here, they were lost, Native Americans befriended them, and that was unfortunately the whitewashed history in our society. And then now you even fast forward now, I do a lot of work. My youngest attends Reese Buffer Central Elementary, so I've spent a lot of time at that school, and we were working through traditional maple syruping and stuff with one of the grades there, and it gave me an opportunity to do some traditional storytelling on the history of maple syrup with Anishinaabe people. And I asked the question, hey, who knows what a Native American is? Blank stares. And so we went from one instance, Pilgrims and Indians, to now we don't want to talk about it. And so that kind of ties into why we're here this morning, which is really great.
Yeah, so you don't have to say anything about this if you don't want to, but as you laid out your timeline there, I couldn't help but notice that reclaiming your Native identity happened to be right around the time you left the church.
Yeah, that was probably, it started just before I left the church, but as and I don't have nothing against church, so I want to make sure that that's clarified and stuff. I'm not anti-church, or otherwise I wouldn't be here this morning. But as I started digging into the history of federal Indian policy in this country, and if you want a starting point, that's really where you need to go back and not look at Google opinions on federal Indian policy, but actually pull the story of federal Indian policy. And I'll provide some resources if people are interested to really look at it. But when I started looking at the atrocities, that most of it started with the Catholic Church, but even eventually the Protestant Church played a role in. And as I reconnected with, in English, the Creator or the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery, I was like, something's off here. And so yeah, it did tie to that. So
and so that's maybe a good launching point for the next question, which is, let's say you watched the presentation this morning, or you've done some learning on your own somewhere, and you're thinking, well, okay, all that stuff happened in the past. Why are we still talking about it today? And so I'm wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit more about that, since you mentioned federal Indian policy, and why does it matter for us to continue to have these conversations today about what has happened?
So one of the things that I also want to mention, as I'm sitting here this morning with you all, is I'm not here to speak for all Native people. I'm not speaking on behalf of tribal nations and stuff. So you're getting my perspective, my life experience, my interactions and stuff. And the reason why I think it's important is we've gotten, we were presented this fluffy, beautiful picture of Pilgrims and Indians, to now it's, there's still just this continual disconnection. And the thing is, you brought up a good point that most people looking at me would be like, you're not Native. They would take a double take. And the thing is, if you look at other races of people that there's historically issues with, you can look at a black person and see they're black, an Asian person and see they're Asian. 90% of the time, you can look at a Native American and not even know they're standing next to you. And so I think the reason it continues to be important to have these types of conversations is, we can connect black people with slavery and Asians with the atrocities that happen with them, or even Hispanic people, but Native people, because Native people we're not wearing buckskins and war paint, riding around on bareback, it's hard for people to connect with that, and especially when the story's not really being told in schools like it should be. And it's probably not going to be told like that for a while, because with black people, we gave them their freedom, and they had their choice to either stay, make a life. Is there barriers to that? Yes. But with Native people, to make it right, you have to acknowledge the boarding schools. And like, you only gave like tip of the iceberg on the boarding schools. Like, it is so atrocious what happened to the kids there. I know personally in my family, we're still looking for a boarding school connection, but my ancestors blended in and pretended to be other ethnicities, and or pretended to be non-native, because children were ripped from their homes and stuff, and it's just a whole mess. But I think, continuing means you learn to reconnect, and as you connect, you get this intentional, unintentional respect for those that you don't know about. And then out of that, it gives the opportunity for healing, for growth, and for restoration. So.
Yeah, and so, you mentioned that a lot of indigenous folks you wouldn't recognize on the street, and so can you maybe, I don't know how deep we want to dive into this, but can you maybe talk a little bit about blood quantum and how that continues to affect people today?
So the worst thing you can ask a Native person is how much blood they are. Unfortunately, because of the history and the harm that indigenous people have suffered, not everybody's going to respond like me. I'm pretty more understanding about it than some of like my community members and some of the other people that I interact with. And the thing you need to understand about blood quantum, there's no other group of people in our country that has to justify how much blood they are. The federal government says you got to be a quarter blood quantum to be Native American, or to participate in like federal education programs, or this program or that program. Luckily, as the tribes continue to advance their sovereignty, the tribes are getting to dictate their citizenship and stuff. Most tribes are going to lineal descent, that if you can solidly tie your history back to one of the individuals on the Indian census roll, you can obtain membership. But the thing about blood quantum is it still continues the genocide. It's basically saying, if you don't meet the standard, you're not who you say you are. And if you look at the whole history of federal Indian policy, it was really meant to perpetrate a form of genocide. That our hair was cut, Pastor Robert had talked about like what happened, like there was corporal punishment for people speaking their native language. Kids, we're talking 3, 4, 5, 6, didn't know any other language, and like they, a lot of them ended up, the harm they suffered led to death. And so like the biggest thing that I want you to understand is the worst question you can ask a Native person is how much blood they are, and just know that there's people, we look at Grand River Band of Ottawa Indians, which occupies the other side of the Grand from Little River. Like they have state sovereignty, but they don't have federal sovereignty, and so they're still fighting for that right. And so they might not, like I could pull an ID card out and slap down who I am, but not every Native person can do that. Sometimes you just got to take them at face value and trust them.
Yeah, thank you, because I think that helps to illustrate why these conversations need to be ongoing, because something like blood quantum, a federal policy that was created over a century ago, that still has a bearing on people today, and it also illustrates for us why tribal sovereignty is so important, because if the United States federal government gets to dictate who's in and who's out, that has very real implications about the ability of a tribe to survive. Whereas if tribes have the sovereignty to say, well, these are who we consider members of our tribe, of our nation, They help ensure their own survival. And so sort of the last big question that I'm hoping we can touch on this morning is this question of sovereignty and control over resources and land. And we all heard it this morning, right? We did our land acknowledgement because that's the bandwagon to jump on right now is do your land acknowledgement. Now, our hope here is that that land acknowledgement will actually mean something, that we won't just say, we did our land acknowledgement, we're good, but that's a start of the process for us. And so you see everybody doing these land acknowledgements, universities, churches, multinational corporations who continue to exploit indigenous people around the world for their products. And that example perhaps shows us how ineffective land acknowledgements can be sometimes, that they are often just empty words, that we say, okay, we acknowledge that other people used to own this land or inhabit this land, and that other people were forcibly removed from this land. Job's done. So you have people who are saying, well, no, job's not done. Something needs to happen here. Some sort of reparation needs to be made. And so there are all kinds of positions on how much land do we give back? Can we give back land? Is it practical? Is it, and so I guess from your perspective, as people who are trying to work towards reconciliation and justice in the world, what are we to do?
So let's real quick talk about sovereignty, because I don't think a lot of people understand like the broad concept of tribal sovereignty. So tribal sovereignty was basically, if it goes back to federal Indian policy. So a lot of the stuff that I'm saying really goes back to that, where the federal government decided to formally recognize the tribal nations that were here before. And basically, sovereignty is supposed to be intended for exactly what it says, that these tribal nations are governments within the nation. Like they're a separate, self-managing, hopefully self-sustaining entity or form of government that gets to self-manage and stuff. That means they get to make up their own rules. I can tell you with my tribe, we have a tribal council that makes executive and legislative decisions. They form policies, rules, laws, and they govern the tribal nation. We have a tribal court that oversees tribal citizens, and so if I violate a tribal law, I could go there and be held accountable, just like we can in the US system. But it's also supposed to help formulate a government-to-government relationship with the state and with the federal governments. Unfortunately, my opinion, and I think there's a lot of other people in Indian country that would agree to this, there's a huge shortfall in that, where both the feds and the state say they recognize their sovereignty, but they already have a line drawn and stuff. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, because sometimes with sovereignty, and we don't have all day to go through the sovereignty thing, but I'll just say that there's still a lot of work and stuff, but the whole intent was to give tribes the freedom to self-determine and be who they are. And as we look at that going forward, I think the land acknowledgement is a good thing, a good starting place, but it can't be the stopping place as we go forward to try and form some sort of bridge and build connection. Because really, when we look at this is really what it's about. It's about trying to restore relationships and bridges and stuff. I can't respect somebody if I don't have a relationship with them. Even trying to sit at the table and work through difficult issues, if there's not some sort of relationship or understanding where I'm at, they understand where I'm at and I understand where they're at, we can't move forward on that. And I told you I teach at Grand Valley. I'm also on the Native American Advisory Council there, which consists of Native faculty, Native community members, but also upper level administration. And we're still wrestling over like the land acknowledgement, because like you said, Pastor Robert, is that a lot of times we think the land acknowledgement's like a magic eraser. Well, if I've done my due diligence, I'm done. But the land acknowledgement can't just be words. it needs to have like action and heart behind it and stuff. And so like as you guys go forward, I would encourage you, and you're probably going to get a little bit of like my natural resource background here, but you know, I think it really has to, it's one thing to acknowledge and say, yep, this was your land, we acknowledge it, sorry that you lost it, we're going to try and make it right. But I think how you start to make it right is you look for opportunities here at the church on how you can start, you know, reflecting back on how my people used to care for the land. Because I can tell you that our native identity was found in 3 areas. It was our connection with the land. We had a strong connection with the land because it was our pharmacy, our housing, our food, our doctor. I mean, everything that we needed came from that. Our connection with each other through our ceremonies, cultures, traditions, and then our connection with the language. And I don't have time to go into the language, but once you start to understand native language, it's basically how we see the world. And so, like when you look at native identity in that context and you make your land acknowledgement, the next step is how can we put action behind those words? And so, like for you guys, you know, I would encourage you to like look at invasive species that are on your property. Can we cut down like fertilizing the grass if we fertilize it, because we have this lake over here and we're going to end up having an effect on the lake. And so, but also too, as a congregation, there's land acknowledgement. But hopefully as you gain understanding, you'll carry that to your own house. I mean, realistically, to try and make things right for Indigenous people is still a long, long road with a bunch of complications, because we can't just like, give me all your houses, you know, and I'm taking my land back. I mean, realistically, that move's not going to happen. But there's other ways where you can, you know, take that land acknowledgement to heart, and, you know, you don't have to declare it publicly, but take it back to your house and make that declaration to yourself, and like start looking at how you can make changes and what things are harming the environment. Can I cut back on my plastic use? Those kind of things. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of simple application. And I answered your question, I hope.
Yeah, no, as you were talking about taking it back home, I'm just thinking of walking from my house to the church every day past all the perfectly manicured grass lawns, and I'm thinking, well, gee, maybe, you know, there are city ordinances that require our lawns to look like that. Maybe that's a place where we need to have a conversation of what do our yards look like if they're more natural. Yeah, because I think what I'm hearing from you is finding ways to honor the land better in our own lives first and build out from there.
I mean, that's the starting place. You know, you start with the land because we were connected with the land, but also like opportunities like this. Like I can tell you, this is like the first time in like a long time that I stepped foot in church, and I never ever thought I would step foot back in the church. And so, you know, just the fact that I'm here, that you guys are doing this, even if you don't understand it, is like a phenomenal thing. It's like a step in the right direction. And I think you know, especially from an Indigenous perspective, you know, people that are like, you know, might be offended or whatever on the Indigenous side, if they would take a step back and be like, hey, you know, we're trying to gain awareness, you know. And so I think it's super awesome that you guys started here this morning. So.
Well, yeah, every journey starts somewhere, and so we are very thankful to have you here with us this morning as we start our journey. Let's show our appreciation again for Rob.